Before I tell you exactly how that little European vacation cost them everything, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. Grab a warm cup of coffee, sit back, and let me tell you the whole story. The drive from my apartment in downtown Portland to my parents' estate in Lake Oswego is exactly 11.3 miles. I know that exact distance because I stared at the odometer on my beat-up 10-year-old Honda Civic for almost the entire drive, white-knuckling the steering wheel. It was December 20th. The Oregon sky was a bruised, heavy gray, spitting a mixture of freezing rain and sleet against my windshield. The wipers squeaked back and forth, a rhythmic, annoying sound that perfectly matched the anxiety twisting in my gut. 2 days prior, my mother had called me. Her voice had carried that rare, sugary sweetness she only ever used when she was trying to prove a point to someone else, or when she wanted something she didn't want to pay for. "Elijah, honey," she had said, her tone dripping with manufactured warmth. "We are having a real family reunion this Christmas. Everyone is going to be here. Your father, Carter, little Grayson. We need you home. It's been too long since we were all under one roof." I am 28 years old. I work as a hospice nurse. My days and nights are spent managing high-dose pain medications, adjusting oxygen flow rates, comforting grieving families who are arguing over funeral arrangements, and sitting quietly in dimly lit rooms holding the hands of people as they take their final, rattling breaths. I am entirely used to heavy, emotionally draining environments. I am used to stress, but absolutely nothing makes my chest tight and my mouth go dry quite like walking up the long, sweeping driveway of my parents' $2.1 million home. I parked my car near the massive iron gates, grabbed my worn canvas duffel bag from the passenger seat, and walked up the stamped concrete path. I unlocked the heavy oak front door and pushed it open. "Mom? Dad?" I called out. The house was dead silent. Usually, when my family gathers, the noise hits you the second you walk in. You can usually hear my older brother, Carter, holding court from the living room, bragging loudly about his latest corporate tax victory or some massive settlement, while my dad pours expensive imported scotch and nods approvingly. You can usually hear my mother barking orders at the catering staff. But today there was nothing. The air inside the house felt noticeably cold. I glanced at the digital thermostat mounted on the hallway wall. It was set to 64 degrees. My mother absolutely hates the cold. She keeps the house at a stifling 72 degrees year-round, regardless of the utility bill. I dropped my bag on the hardwood floor and walked slowly into the sprawling living room. The massive stone fireplace was completely cold, filled with gray, day-old ash. The only living soul in the room was my 82-year-old grandfather, Arthur. He was sitting in his worn-out, creaky rocking chair by the large bay window, staring out at the dead, frost-covered rose bushes in the garden. He was wearing his thick plaid flannel shirt and faded corduroy pants. He didn't turn around when I walked in. He just kept looking straight ahead, his jaw set, his hands resting heavily on the wooden armrests. "Grandpa," I said softly, stepping closer. "Where is everybody? Where's Mom?" He slowly turned his head toward me. His face was entirely unreadable. He didn't speak a single word. He just raised a gnarled, arthritic finger and pointed toward the massive granite island in the kitchen. I felt a cold dread settle in my stomach. I walked past him, my boots echoing against the floorboards, and entered the pristine kitchen. Sitting perfectly in the center of the dark granite counter was a piece of pastel pink stationery, torn freshly from my mother's expensive Williams Sonoma notepad. Her handwriting was flawless, practiced cursive, the kind of handwriting that belongs to someone who cares deeply about appearances. I picked it up. The paper felt thick and heavy between my fingers. "Elijah, emergency change of plans. Carter invited us to Europe for the holidays. His treat. So generous. We leave this morning. You'll stay with Grandpa Arthur through the 30th. He needs his meds twice daily. You're a nurse, you know the drill. There's a Stouffer's lasagna in the freezer. P.S. Maybe caregiving is your real calling since nursing hasn't exactly made you successful." I stood there in the dead silence of that massive kitchen and read the note 3 times. I didn't yell. I didn't tear the paper to shreds. I didn't throw it across the room. I just carefully, methodically folded it along the creases my mother had already made and slid it deep into the front pocket of my jacket. My jaw locked so tight my back teeth ached. They had planned this. Every single detail of this was premeditated. They had completely fabricated the emotional family reunion story just to get me in the door, so they wouldn't have to hire an overnight sitter or a professional medical aid for my grandfather. My brother makes a base salary of $285,000 a year as a high-powered lawyer. My parents have millions in assets. They could easily afford the best private care in the state of Oregon. But why pay a professional when you can trick your unsuccessful younger brother into doing it for free? I choked back the anger burning in my throat. I told myself it was just 10 days. The holiday would be over soon. But they didn't know what Grandpa Arthur had been observing from that rocking chair all these years. And they had absolutely no idea what the two of us were about to do next. To understand why I didn't just turn around, walk out that front door, and leave them to deal with the consequences of their own actions, you have to understand the history of this family. I have spent my entire 31 years on this earth as the backup plan, the understudy, the afterthought. Carter was always the golden child. He was loud, aggressive, highly competitive, and utterly obsessed with status. He went to a prestigious law school on the East Coast. I stayed local and went to nursing school. In my father's rigid, traditional eyes, ambitious men did not become nurses. Ambitious men ran massive companies, filed lawsuits, and destroyed their competition in court. Nursing was deemed a soft profession, a respectable charity at best, and a profound disappointment at worst. I remember the morning of May 19, 2018, with crystal clarity. It was my nursing school graduation day. It had taken me 4 years of grueling clinical rotations, studying until my vision blurred, and working exhausting night shifts as a certified nursing assistant just to pay my rent and buy my textbooks. My parents didn't contribute a single dime to my tuition. They had completely drained my childhood college fund years earlier to help cover Carter's expensive networking events, his tailored suits, and a massive down payment on his luxury condo in Seattle. The morning of my graduation, I was standing in my cramped, poorly lit apartment, carefully ironing my only dress shirt. My phone buzzed on the cheap laminate counter. It was a text from my mother. "Sweetie, so sorry. Carter has an emergency deposition in Seattle today. Very important case. Dad and I are flying up to support him. So proud of you. Dinner on us next month." 30 seconds later, before I could even process the text, my phone chimed again. A Venmo notification. My mother had sent me exactly $100. That was it. For years of blood, sweat, and literal tears, for years of sacrificing sleep and a social life, and I was given $100 and an empty row of seats in the auditorium. I drove to the graduation venue alone. I sat in Section F, Row 4, Seat 12, entirely by myself. The massive auditorium echoed with the sounds of 126 other students being cheered on by their screaming, crying, proud families. I sat there in my cap and gown, feeling a heavy, dark, sinking emptiness in my gut. I kept telling myself it didn't matter. I told myself I was doing this for me, not for their approval. But it hurt. It felt like a physical weight pressing down on my chest. Right before the university president stepped up to the podium to begin the ceremony, a shadow fell over my aisle. I looked up. It was Grandpa Arthur. He was wearing his vintage navy blue suit from 1987. It was slightly frayed at the cuffs, but perfectly pressed. He had a cheap, $12 bouquet of carnations from the local grocery store clutched tightly in his weathered hand, the bright yellow price tag still dangling from the crinkling plastic wrap. He didn't say a single word about my parents not being there. He didn't offer any empty platitudes. He just sat down heavily in the metal folding chair next to me, patted my knee with his heavy, calloused hand, and turned his attention to the stage. When they finally called my name and I walked across that stage to accept my diploma, I looked out into the sea of people. Grandpa Arthur was standing up. He was clapping louder and harder than anyone else in that entire section. That day, looking at the proud tears in his old eyes, I learned exactly who my real family was. The divide between me and my parents only grew wider and more toxic as the years passed. They measured worth exclusively by income, and my salary was a constant source of embarrassment to them. Fast forward to December 14th, 2020. I was turning 28 years old, and the entire world was falling apart. I was working brutal, back-to-back 16-hour shifts in the intensive care COVID ward. It was a nightmare landscape of beeping ventilators, frantic code blues, and overwhelming despair. I was watching terrified people die completely isolated from their families. I spent hours holding iPads up to the faces of dying patients so they could say their final, ragged goodbyes to their weeping spouses and children through a glowing screen. It systematically broke me down piece by piece. I came home every single night, stripped my contaminated scrubs off in the freezing hallway of my apartment building, and stood under the scalding hot shower, scrubbing my skin with harsh soap until it was red and raw, absolutely terrified I was going to bring the virus into my home. It was the night of my birthday. I was sitting on my cold bathroom floor, leaning against the porcelain tub, completely physically and emotionally drained. I was staring blankly at the tile grout. I just needed to hear my mother's voice. I needed someone, anyone, to tell me it was going to be okay. I picked up my phone with shaking hands and dialed her number. She answered on the second ring. "Mom," I choked out, the exhaustion and fear finally breaking through my defenses, the tears spilling over hot and fast. "Mom, I just held another man's hand while he died today. He was entirely alone. I'm terrified. I can't do this anymore. I feel like I'm drowning." "Oh, Elijah, honey, I really can't talk right now," she said, swiftly cutting me off. Her voice was bright, bubbly, and entirely disconnected from the horrific reality I was living in. In the background, I could hear the distinct sound of crystal glasses clinking and loud, booming laughter. We are on a massive Zoom call celebrating Carter's big promotion to senior associate. His firm partners are on the line right now. This is a huge, pivotal moment for his career. "I'll call you back later, okay? Love you." She hung up the phone before I could manage to say another word. The dial tone hummed a flat, dead note against my ear. I sat on that cold bathroom floor in the dark for another hour, just listening to the silence of my apartment. She never called back that night. The very next morning, I opened my email app. I had an automated message from her. "Happy birthday, Elijah. Treat yourself to something nice." Attached to the email was a $25 Starbucks digital gift card. My brother had just secured a corporate promotion pushing his base salary well over $300,000 a year, and I was given roughly 4 cups of coffee to celebrate surviving another week on the front lines of a global pandemic. I took a screenshot of that email. I didn't consciously know why I did it at the time. A deep, instinctual part of my brain just knew that someday, eventually, I would desperately need documented proof that I wasn't crazy, that this level of callous disregard was actually happening. It became such a predictable, agonizing cycle that I stopped fighting it. By Thanksgiving of 2022, I didn't even expect them to show up for me. I called my dad a week before the holiday just to ask what time I should bring the pumpkin pies over to the house. "Oh, Elijah," my dad said into the phone, his tone instantly betraying his profound annoyance that I had even bothered to ask. "We're flying out to Boston tomorrow. Carter's executive MBA program has a prestigious family networking weekend. It's absolutely critical for his career trajectory and future partnerships. You understand how these things work. Carter already had a top-tier law degree. He didn't need an executive MBA. He certainly didn't need his parents to fly thousands of miles across the country to hold his hand at a cocktail networking event. But the event had the Harvard name attached to it, and my parents lived and breathed for that kind of elite prestige. Once again, they packed their designer luggage and left Grandpa Arthur behind in the empty house. I drove over, picked Grandpa up in my Civic, and brought him back to my tiny, drafty 500-square-foot apartment. The radiator in my living room was broken, so we had to wear our sweaters indoors. I had never attempted to cook a whole turkey before. It was an absolute disaster. One side of the bird was charred black and smoking, and the other side was as dry and tough as sawdust. We ate instant, powdery mashed potatoes from a cardboard box, and gelatinous cranberry sauce straight out of the tin can. I didn't even own a proper dining table, so we sat side by side on my lumpy pull-out sofa, balancing flimsy paper plates on our knees. I kept profusely apologizing for the terrible food, feeling like a complete failure of a host. But Grandpa just shook his head. He took a slow, deliberate bite of the bone-dry turkey, looked around my cramped, freezing apartment, and said, "Elijah, this is the best Thanksgiving dinner I've had in 30 years. I chuckled bitterly, thinking he was just trying to spare my feelings. "Come on, Grandpa. Stop. The turkey tastes like a leather boot." "I am entirely serious," he said, setting his cheap plastic fork down on the paper plate. He turned to look directly at me, and his pale blue eyes were razor-sharp, piercing. "It's the best because someone actually wanted me here. They didn't just tolerate my presence out of obligation." I didn't know what to say to that. A lump formed in my throat. I realized then that Grandpa saw absolutely everything. He played the part of the quiet, fading, irrelevant old man perfectly, but his mind was a steel trap. He was watching my parents. He was watching Carter. He saw how they treated anyone who couldn't advance their social standing. And he was silently, meticulously keeping score. All of this painful history brings us right back to that freezing December afternoon in 2024. Right before I drove to the Lake Oswego house. Right before I found that vile pink note sitting on the granite counter, my fiancée, Sarah, had desperately tried to warn me. Sarah is a high school history teacher. She is incredibly grounded, fiercely tough, and fiercely protective of the people she loves. She had seen families torn apart by bitter divorce and greed in her own life, and she saw right through my family's polished veneer from day one. When I got off the phone with my mother, after she delivered the whole emotional family reunion speech, Sarah was standing in our small kitchen, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. "Elijah, do not go," she said flatly, her voice leaving no room for argument. "Sarah, they specifically asked me to come home." Mom sounded like she actually meant it this time. She sounded warm. "Maybe things are changing. It's Christmas." She sighed heavily, walking over and placing a warm hand flat against my chest. "People do not change, Eli. Patterns change. And their established pattern is using you until there's nothing left. When was the exact last time they invited you to anything without needing a massive favor in return?" I immediately got defensive. It's a bizarre, pathetic instinct. You spend your entire life being emotionally battered by your parents, but the second someone else points out the abuse, you throw up your shield to protect them. "They're my family, Sarah," I argued, my voice rising defensively. "I have to give them the benefit of the doubt. What if Grandpa really wants to see me? I love Arthur, you know that," she replied softly, looking deep into my eyes. "But your parents? You don't have to be their doormat, Elijah. You consciously choose to let them walk all over you." She was right. I knew it deep down in the marrow of my bones. But the desperate, lingering hope of a neglected child is a hard thing to kill. I packed my canvas duffel bag anyway. I drove the cold, icy 11.3 miles. And I walked straight into that empty, silent house, proving her absolutely right. When I stood in that pristine kitchen holding the pink piece of paper, staring at my mother's handwriting actively mocking my career and my life choices, the very last thread of hope I had for my family finally, permanently snapped. Sarah's warning echoed loudly in my head. I pulled my phone out of my pocket and sent her a text. "You were right. They lied. They're gone. It's just me and Grandpa." She texted back immediately, the typing bubbles appearing instantly. "I'm coming over right now. I'll bring dinner." "No," I typed back, my thumbs hitting the screen with fierce precision. "Stay there. Let me handle this." I slipped the phone back into my pocket, took a deep breath, and turned around to face my grandfather. I walked slowly out of the kitchen and back into the living room. Grandpa Arthur was still sitting in the creaky rocking chair, his eyes fixed on the frost-covered window panes. I walked straight past him, my boots thudding against the Persian rugs, and headed for the massive, commercial-grade stainless steel Sub-Zero refrigerator. I yanked the heavy door open. The blast of cold air hit my face, and the cavernous interior of the fridge was practically echoing. It was so empty. Sitting on the pristine glass shelves was a half-empty carton of skim milk that had expired 2 days ago, a crusty jar of Dijon mustard, and 3 wilting, brown-tipped carrots in the crisper drawer. That was it. I pulled open the heavy freezer drawer below. Sitting right in the exact dead center of the empty wire rack was a single cardboard box. A family-sized Stouffer's meat lasagna. The bright yellow grocery store clearance sticker was still aggressively slapped on the front of the box. $8.99. My parents, who possessed millions of dollars in liquid assets and real estate, had gone to Europe for 10 days, and they deliberately left an 82-year-old man with advanced type 2 diabetes exactly $9 worth of highly processed frozen food to survive on. A hot, blinding, suffocating wave of anger washed over me. It wasn't the slow, depressive, familiar ache of disappointment I usually felt when dealing with my family. This was pure, unadulterated, violent rage. I slammed the heavy freezer door shut with both hands. The metallic crash echoed sharply through the massive, empty house. "Don't break the hinges, boy," Grandpa said from the living room. His voice was completely steady, devoid of any surprise or panic. I stormed out to him, my hands shaking. "Grandpa, they left you with absolutely nothing. Did they even bother to check your blood sugar before they ordered their Uber to the airport?" He slowly reached a trembling hand into his worn flannel shirt pocket and pulled out a small, tattered leather notebook. "I checked it myself this morning. 132. Good enough for an old man." I shook my head, the clinical instincts of a seasoned hospice nurse instantly overriding the anger of a neglected son. "No, that's not good enough. I'm setting up a strict schedule right now. We check it twice a day, morning and night. I'm going to the store to buy real food." Right at that moment, my cell phone buzzed violently in my pocket. It was an unknown local number. I swiped to answer it. "Hello, Elijah? Oh, thank God. Is that you?" The voice on the other end was thick, wet with tears, and trembling. It was Maria, the loyal housekeeper who had worked faithfully for my family for over 15 years. "Maria, what's wrong? Are you okay?" "Your mother," she sniffled loudly, her voice breaking. "She called me late last night. She told me I was suspended without pay for the next 2 weeks. She said the house would be entirely empty, and she didn't want to pay me my hourly rate to clean and used rooms. I asked her about your grandfather, and she coldly told me not to worry about it, that she had handled it. Elijah, I am so sorry. I wanted to come check on him today, but I can't afford the gas without my holiday pay." I gripped the cold edge of the granite counter so hard my knuckles turned stark white. My mother had purposefully canceled the one reliable person who could have kept a watchful eye on my grandfather, just to save a few $100s on domestic labor while she flew first class to Europe. "It's okay, Maria," I said, forcing my voice to stay calm and soothing despite the fury boiling in my veins. "I'm here now. He's safe with me. I'll make sure you get your holiday pay. I promise. Enjoy your time off." I hung up the phone and looked over at Grandpa Arthur. He was watching me closely from the chair. He didn't ask what the call was about. He already knew exactly who and what his daughter was. The next morning, the house was suffocatingly quiet. I had gone out late the night before and stocked the fridge with fresh vegetables, lean proteins, and proper groceries. Grandpa and I were sitting at the kitchen table, drinking black coffee brewed from his ancient, plastic Mr. Coffee machine that he insisted on keeping on the counter. Suddenly, the shrill ringtone of my phone shattered the peace. I looked at the caller ID. It read Aunt Clara. Clara is my mother's older sister. They are cut from the exact same poisonous cloth. Obsessed with outward appearances, highly critical of everyone around them, and deeply, inherently manipulative. Clara had been through 3 messy divorces, lived entirely on alimony, and thrived on family drama. I let the phone ring 3 long times before I finally hit accept. "Elijah, my goodness, I just heard the terrible news." Clara's voice boomed through the speaker, overly loud and dramatically breathless. "Your mother just texted me from Paris. I absolutely cannot believe they left you there all alone to play nursemaid during the holidays. It is completely, utterly unacceptable. It's fine, Aunt Clara. I'm managing, I said carefully, keeping my tone perfectly neutral. No, it is certainly not fine, she insisted, her voice rising in pitch. Carter is so incredibly selfish, dragging your poor parents all the way to Europe and leaving you with the heavy burden. You must be completely exhausted. Tell me, how is Arthur holding up? Is his mind slipping? Your mother mentioned to me last week that he was getting very difficult to handle and confused. I frowned deeply. Grandpa wasn't difficult to handle, and his mind was infinitely sharper than mine on my best day. He's perfectly fine, Clara. We're just sitting here having morning coffee. And then I heard it. A faint, distinct, static echo on the line. The unmistakable auditory signature of a slight technological delay. She had me on speakerphone, and beneath the sound of her heavy breathing, I heard the crisp, distinct clinking of heavy silverware on fine china, and the faint, unmistakable wail of a European police siren in the deep background. Clara was supposedly sitting in her high-rise condo in downtown Portland. There were absolutely no European sirens in Portland. Clara was executing a reconnaissance mission. She was on a muted three-way call with my mother sitting in a cafe in Paris. They were trying to bait me. They wanted to see if I was angry, if I was threatening to abandon Grandpa, or if I was simply playing the good, quiet, obedient little servant they fully expected me to be. A profound coldness settled over me. I looked across the table at Grandpa. I leaned slightly closer to the phone's microphone. You know what, Aunt Clara? You're actually right. It is incredibly exhausting. But Mom left a very clear note, and I know my place in this family hierarchy. I'm just grateful I have a job that prepared me to clean up other people's messes. Tell Mom I hope the Parisian croissants are good. I hit the red end call button before she could formulate a response. I set the phone face down on the table. I looked up at Grandpa. He took a slow, deliberate sip of his bitter black coffee. Your mother's sister? He asked quietly. Yeah, she was checking in for them, trying to see if I was going to crack. Grandpa chuckled, a dry, raspy, humorless sound that rattled in his chest. A nest of vipers, Elijah. The whole miserable lot of them. That night, the anger kept me wired awake. Couldn't sleep. I sat on the edge of the twin bed in my old childhood bedroom, which my parents had long ago converted into a glorified storage unit. I was surrounded by heavy cardboard boxes of Carter's old college textbooks and discarded sports trophies that my mother had never bothered to throw away. The room smelled like dust and neglect. I pulled my phone out of my pocket and opened the Instagram app. I intentionally navigated to my sister-in-law's page. Carter's wife, Brittany, is a textbook narcissist who meticulously documents every single waking second of her luxurious life for her 3,000 followers. Sure enough, the glowing circle around her profile picture indicated her story was freshly updated. I tapped it. The first photo was a shot of spacious, lie-flat first-class seats on Air France. 2 crystal flutes of champagne were resting on the center console. The caption, written in a loopy font, read, "Off to Paris. So incredibly blessed." The second photo was a wide-angle shot of the opulent lobby of Le Muris, a legendary luxury hotel in Paris that I knew for a fact cost well over $1,000 a single night. The third photo was a sprawling, decadent dinner spread at a famous Michelin star restaurant, featuring truffles and caviar. I pulled a yellow legal pad out of my duffel bag, grabbed a pen, and started doing the brutal math. Working in healthcare, I knew exactly how to budget, and I knew exactly what commercial flights cost. I quickly looked up the current peak holiday hotel rates on my phone. I estimated the lavish dinners based on the specific location tags she was proudly using. 4 nights in Paris, 3 nights at a ski resort in the Swiss Alps, and 3 nights concluding in Venice. First-class flights for 3 adults and a toddler flying out of Portland International. Roughly $30,000. Luxury, 5-star hotel suites for 10 total nights, $32,000. Michelin star dining, daily excursions, and designer shopping, conservatively estimated at $10,000. Total estimated cost, $72,000. I sat there in the dim light of the storage room and stared at the number written in blue ink on my pad. $72,000. Then I clicked on the next slide of Brittany's endless story. It was a perfectly filtered picture of my parents, standing arm in arm, holding up expensive wine glasses in front of the illuminated Eiffel Tower. The caption read, "Beyond grateful for the best in-laws in the entire world. Thank you so much Robert and Diane for treating us to this magical Christmas. #spoiled, #family vacation." My stomach violently dropped. The physical sensation was sickening. The pink note left on the kitchen counter clearly said Carter invited them. His treat. So generous. It was a complete, calculated lie. My parents had paid for the entire extravagant trip. They happily dropped $72,000 to take their golden child and his insufferable wife to Europe, while actively, maliciously suspending the loyal housekeeper's pay and leaving me an $8 frozen lasagna to babysit my grandfather. I earned exactly $68,000 a year doing backbreaking, emotionally devastating labor. They spent more than my entire gross annual salary on a 10-day vacation that they explicitly, intentionally excluded me from. I heard a floorboard creak in the hallway. I looked up quickly. Grandpa Arthur was standing in the doorway, his silhouette illuminated by the hall light. He looked down at the legal pad resting on my knee. He didn't ask what I was doing. He didn't ask why I looked like I was going to be sick. He just looked at me with those ancient, sharp eyes. "They have always bought his affection," Grandpa said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of decades of observation. "Always. And they expected you to blindly give yours for free, because they think money is the only thing on this earth that commands respect." He turned around and walked slowly back down the dark hall. The following morning was December 24th, Christmas Eve. I woke up early, my body exhausted but my mind racing, and went downstairs to make breakfast. Before my foot even hit the bottom step, I heard Grandpa's voice. He was standing in the main hallway, clutching the receiver of the beige rotary phone permanently attached to the wall. He despised cell phones and never used his unless it was an absolute emergency. I stopped dead in my tracks in the shadows of the living room, staying completely out of his line of sight. "Yes, Bernard. It's Arthur," he said into the receiver. I froze. His voice was completely different. It wasn't the soft, slow, slightly confused cadence of the frail elderly man he expertly played whenever my parents were in the room. It was firm. It was commanding. It had the deep gravel and absolute authority of a man who used to run massive logging crews in the unforgiving Pacific Northwest. There was a pause as the man on the other end spoke. Then Grandpa replied, "I know it's a holiday week, Bernard. I frankly don't care. I am paying your retainer. I need you at the house on the 28th. 2 o'clock sharp." Another pause. "Bring everything. The trust documents. The will. The durable power of attorney. We are restructuring the entire estate." I held my breath, pressing my back against the wall. Restructuring? My father had complained for years that Grandpa was slowly bleeding through his meager retirement savings on medical bills and charity donations. Dad firmly assumed Grandpa only had a couple $100,000 left in his accounts from the sale of his small lumber business decades ago. "No, Gerald doesn't know," Grandpa barked into the phone, using my father's actual given name with dripping disdain. "And he's not going to know a damn thing until the ink is dry and legally binding. Just be here, Bernard. Don't be late." He slammed the heavy plastic receiver back onto the wall cradle. I quickly backed up a few steps, then stepped forward heavily, pretending I was just coming down the stairs for the first time. I walked into the kitchen, rubbing my eyes. Grandpa was standing perfectly still by the coffee maker, his posture incredibly straight, his shoulders squared. "Morning, Grandpa," I said, opening the fridge to grab a carton of eggs. He turned his head and looked at me. He didn't flinch. He didn't try to hide what he was doing. He didn't formulate a quick lie about calling a doctor or a friend. He just nodded slowly. "Elijah," he said, his voice dropping an octave, resonating in the quiet kitchen. You are a good man. You work incredibly hard. You have a spine, even if you let them bend it sometimes. I stopped cracking the egg against the ceramic bowl. Grandpa? What are you talking about? Justice is a very funny thing, he said, turning to look out the kitchen window at the frost-covered lawn. Sometimes it takes 80 long years to finally arrive. But when it does, it's very precise. And it's very clean. He looked back at me, and for the very first time since I had arrived at that awful house, he smiled. It wasn't a warm, grandfatherly smile. It was tactical. It was the smile of a predator that had finally trapped its prey. Things are going to change around here, boy. Make sure the coffee is strong on the 28th. The next few days leading up to the 28th were, surprisingly, the most peaceful, serene Christmases I had ever experienced in my entire adult life. There was no chaotic screaming over televised football games. There were no passive-aggressive, cutting comments from my mother about my cheap clothes, my lack of a mortgage, or the size of my apartment. There was no Carter dominating the room, demanding everyone's attention with exaggerated stories about his brilliant corporate acquisitions. It was just me and an 82-year-old man in a massive, profoundly quiet house. On Christmas morning, it actually snowed. A light, beautiful dusting of white powder covered the manicured lawns of Lake Oswego. We didn't bother to exchange wrapped gifts. We didn't need the performative ritual. I stood in the kitchen and made buttermilk pancakes completely from scratch, not out of a cardboard box. After we finished breakfast, Grandpa put on his heavy canvas winter coat, and we walked out to the cold garden shed in the back. He had an old, scarred wooden workbench set up in the back of the shed. We spent 4 solid hours working shoulder to shoulder, quietly sanding down and meticulously restaining an old oak chair he had found at a flea market. The sharp, clean smell of sawdust, motor oil, and dark wood stain filled the small, freezing space. Felt incredibly grounding. I started Weston Timber Holdings in 1965, Grandpa said suddenly, wiping a rag covered in mineral spirits across the exposed wood grain. I had exactly 1 battered truck, 1 single logging crew. I drove that truck myself for 15 grueling years, bleeding knuckles every day, a bad back that still aches when it rains. Your grandmother did all the complex accounting sitting at our tiny kitchen table. Dad always says you sold the business in the late 90s to stay afloat, I said carefully, blowing dust off the sandpaper. 2012, Grandpa corrected sharply, his eyes narrowing. I sold it to a massive national conglomerate in 2012. Your father firmly thinks I spent all the money over the years. He thinks I foolishly gave it away to charity or lost it playing the stock market. He actively treats me like a dependent child because he thinks I'm a financial burden to his precious lifestyle. I stopped sanding, the grit rough against my palms. Are you a burden, Grandpa? I asked softly. He stopped wiping the chair. He looked at me, and a fierce, undeniable fire flared in his pale eyes. I intentionally let him think I was, he said, his voice hard as iron. I wanted to see exactly how a man treats his own father when he believes there's absolutely no money left to inherit. I wanted to see who my family really was when the financial well seemingly went dry. He tossed the dirty rag onto the wooden bench. And over the last decade, I got my definitive answer. He turned around and walked slowly back toward the house, leaving me standing alone in the freezing shed. I looked at the rusted antique tools hanging meticulously on the pegboard wall. My parents and my brother had absolutely no idea who they were dealing with. They arrogantly thought they had left a sick, toothless old dog behind to die quietly. They had actually, foolishly, locked themselves in a cage with a wolf. December 28th. 1:55 p.m. I had spent the entire morning deep cleaning the house, needing the physical labor to burn off my nervous energy. I brewed a fresh, strong pot of French roast coffee. Grandpa was sitting in the dining room. He wasn't wearing his faded flannel. He was wearing his absolute best suit. Not the cheap, frayed navy one from my nursing graduation, but a sharp, impeccably tailored, dark gray wool suit I had never even seen before. He sat perfectly rigid at the head of the massive, polished mahogany dining table that my mother only ever used for show to impress her wealthy friends. At exactly 2 p.m., the heavy brass doorbell chimed, echoing through the foyer. I walked to the front door, my pulse throbbing in my throat, and pulled it open. Standing on the sweeping porch was a man in his late 60s. He wore an immaculate, bespoke charcoal pinstripe suit, a subtle silk tie, and carried a thick, incredibly expensive-looking leather briefcase. He radiated the kind of intense posture and aura that commanded immediate, unquestioning respect. This was a man who destroyed lives legally for a living. "Elijah Weston," he said, holding out a manicured hand. "I am Bernard Price. It is a distinct pleasure to finally meet you." "Come in, Mr. Price," I said, shaking his hand. His grip was firm. I stepped aside to let him pass. He walked purposefully into the formal dining room. Grandpa didn't bother to stand up, but he gave a curt, respectful nod. "Bernard, you have the documents prepared." "I have absolutely everything, Arthur," Bernard said smoothly, setting the heavy leather briefcase on the polished mahogany table and snapping the brass combination locks open with a loud clack. He reached inside and pulled out a massive stack of heavy, legal-sized papers printed on thick, cream-colored stock. The fully updated revocable living trust, the new last will and testament, and the revised durable power of attorney designations. "Sit down, Elijah," Grandpa commanded, pointing to the chair immediately to his right. I sat down. My heart was pounding so hard against my ribs I thought Bernard could hear it across the table. Bernard slid an expensive Mont Blanc fountain pen across the smooth wood to Grandpa. Then he looked directly into my eyes. His expression was completely serious. "Elijah, what happens in this room today permanently alters the financial trajectory and the power dynamic of this entire family. Your grandfather requested my physical presence here specifically to ensure that when your parents and brother return from Europe, there is absolutely zero ambiguity about his mental capacity or his legal intentions. I am here to execute his ironclad will, and I am here to ruthlessly defend it against any challenges." Grandpa picked up the heavy gold pen. He didn't hesitate for a fraction of a second. He didn't bother to read through the dense legal jargon on the pages. He just started signing his name, one page after another. The scratching sound of the metal nib on the thick paper was the only sound in the dead-silent room. When he finally finished the very last signature, Bernard pulled a heavy metal stamp from his pocket and pressed it onto the paper, sealing it with a loud thump. "It is officially done," Bernard said, meticulously sliding the executed papers back into the custom folders and placing them in his briefcase. He looked down at his silver Rolex watch. "They are scheduled to arrive back from Paris on the 30th, correct?" "Yes," Grandpa said, his voice echoing with finality. "Tomorrow afternoon. I will be sitting right here when they walk through that door," Bernard stated, his tone completely flat, devoid of any sympathy or emotion. "I highly suggest you brace yourself, Elijah. The emotional and legal fallout of what we just did will be incredibly significant." I looked at the empty space on the mahogany table where the stack of papers had just been resting. I didn't know the exact dollar amounts yet. I didn't know the full, devastating scope of what Grandpa Arthur had just legally orchestrated. But as I sat there, smelling the fresh ink and the old wood of the room, I knew one thing for absolute certain. When those 3 luxury cars pulled into the driveway the next day, my parents and my golden child brother were going to walk completely blind into a spinning buzzsaw. Biting chill in the air. The sky over Lake Oswego was a flat, unforgiving gray. Inside the house, the atmosphere was thick. It felt like the air before a massive thunderstorm, heavy and electrified. I had built a roaring fire in the massive stone fireplace. Grandpa Arthur sat in his worn rocking chair, completely still, wearing his tailored dark gray suit. Bernard Price sat perfectly upright on the plush leather sofa, his expensive briefcase resting on the coffee table in front of him. I stood by the window watching the driveway. My hands were shoved deep into my pockets to hide the slight tremor in my fingers. At exactly 2:34 p.m., I heard the distinct crunch of tires on the gravel road leading up to the estate. It wasn't just one car. It was a parade. 3 luxury vehicles practically glided through the iron gates. Leading the pack was my father's pristine Porsche Cayenne. Right behind him was Carter's obscenely massive Rolls-Royce Ghost. Bringing up the rear was my mother's bright red Ferrari Roma. They parked in a neat row, the engines purring before shutting off in unison. The heavy car doors slammed. I could hear their loud, arrogant laughter echoing across the cold driveway before they even reached the porch. God, I desperately missed American coffee. Carter's voice boomed through the thick oak door. Just leave the bags in the foyer, Gerald. We can have Maria unpack them tomorrow. My mother chimed in, her voice bright and bubbly. She still hadn't realized Maria wasn't coming back anytime soon. The front door swung open. They spilled into the grand foyer, a whirlwind of designer winter coats, expensive leather luggage, and golden European tans. Carter was carrying his 3-year-old son, Grayson, who was clutching a giant stuffed bear. My mother, Diane, was pulling a massive Louis Vuitton trunk, laughing at something my father had just said. They walked through the arched doorway into the living room, and the laughter died instantly. It was like someone had flipped a breaker switch. My father, Robert, stopped dead in his tracks. His eyes darted from me, standing quietly by the fire, to Grandpa Arthur in his sharp suit, and finally landed on Bernard Price. Bernard didn't stand up. He simply adjusted his silk tie and stared back with eyes as cold and hard as granite. "Dad," my father said slowly, his voice dropping all of its jovial warmth. "What exactly is going on here? Who is this man in my living room?" Grandpa Arthur didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "Sit down, Robert." My mother stepped out from behind my father, her hand instinctively creeping up to touch her pearl necklace. "Arthur, what is this? We just got off a 12-hour flight. We are exhausted. Is something wrong?" "I said sit down," Grandpa repeated. The absolute command in his voice left absolutely zero room for argument or negotiation. Carter puffed out his chest, his lawyer instincts kicking into high gear. He dropped his designer duffel bag on the hardwood floor with a heavy thud. "Grandpa, if this is about money or medical bills, we can discuss this privately. You don't need to bring a stranger into the house." "This is Bernard Price," Grandpa said evenly. "He is my attorney, and you will all sit down and shut your mouths until he is finished speaking." My parents exchanged a panicked, confused look. They rigidly walked over and perched on the very edge of the love seat, looking incredibly uncomfortable. Carter dragged a heavy wooden dining chair into the room, the legs scraping loudly against the floor. He sat down, and his right knee immediately started bouncing up and down. It was a nervous tell he had possessed since childhood. He only did that when he felt he was losing control of a room. I stayed standing by the fireplace, keeping myself entirely separate from them. Bernard smoothly popped the brass locks on his briefcase. The click sounded like a gunshot in the silent room. He pulled out the thick stack of legal documents and rested his hands completely flat on top of them. "Diane, Robert, Carter," Bernard began, his voice completely devoid of emotion. "Your grandfather has asked me here today to formally execute and announce significant, irrevocable changes to his estate plan and his revocable living trust." "His estate," Carter scoffed loudly, rolling his eyes. "Look, Mr. Price, with all due respect, my grandfather has maybe a couple $100,000 left to his name. My father manages his living expenses. You're wasting your billable hours." Bernard stared at Carter for 3 long seconds. He didn't blink. "I assure you, Mr. Weston, I do not waste my time, and you are about to find out exactly how profoundly misinformed you are." Bernard picked up the first document. He cleared his throat, a sharp sound that commanded total silence. "I will read the summary of assets as verified and finalized on December 28th, Bernard stated. "The Arthur James Weston Revocable Living Trust. Total verified liquid assets, diversified investment portfolios, and real estate holdings." He paused, looking directly at my father. $20,347,000. My mother actually gasped. Her manicured hand flew up and violently covered her mouth. My father's face drained of all color. He looked like he had just been physically struck in the stomach. 20 million? Dad, I thought you told me you spent the buyout money. You told me the company sale barely covered your taxes and debts. You aggressively assumed I was poor, Robert, Grandpa said quietly. You assumed I was a financial burden. I simply allowed you to believe your own arrogant assumptions. I wanted to see exactly who loved me when I had absolutely nothing to offer them. Carter stopped bouncing his knee. He leaned forward, his eyes wide and hungry, immediately calculating the massive inheritance. Okay, wow. Grandpa, that is incredible. So, what are the new terms of the trust? Bernard didn't look up from the paper. Distribution of the estate is as follows. To his son, Robert Gerald Weston, a one-time lump sum of $250,000. My father's jaw dropped completely open. What? That's barely 1%. To his daughter-in-law, Diane Marie Weston, $250,000. Bernard continued, his voice cutting through my father's outrage. My mother let out a small, pathetic whimpering sound. To his grandson, Carter Alexander Weston, $250,000. Carter shot up out of his chair. Are you out of your mind? 250? I am your oldest grandson. I carry the family name. Bernard ignored him completely. To designated charities, specifically the Oregon Hospice Foundation, for $1,500,000. The room was so quiet I could hear the antique grandfather clock ticking in the hallway. My family was entirely paralyzed by shock. And finally, Bernard said, his voice ringing with absolute unshakable authority. To his grandson Elijah James Weston, $15,047,000. Furthermore, Elijah Weston is granted full, uncontested discretionary control over the principal trust. Any future distributions, loans, or financial assistance to any other family member will be entirely at his sole discretion. Nobody breathed. For 10 excruciating seconds, nobody moved a muscle. $15 million. The number echoed in my head. I made $68,000 a year. I struggled to pay for my groceries. I drove a car with a check engine light that had been on for 6 months. I looked at Grandpa Arthur. He was looking right back at me, his eyes shining with a fierce, protective pride. Carter broke the silence. 15 million? He whispered, his voice trembling with a mixture of raw panic and absolute fury. He turned and pointed a shaking finger directly at my chest. You manipulated him, you disgusting, manipulative little rat. You stayed here alone with him and poisoned his mind. I didn't do a single thing but make sure he didn't die while you were drinking champagne in Paris, Carter. I said, my voice eerily calm. This is the moment that changes everything, the moment I finally took back control of my life. Thank you so much for your patience and for staying with me until now. You've been amazing. Please give this video a like and comment 1 below to let me know you've made it this far. Not only does this help more people find this story, but it also lets me know that my experiences truly mean something to someone. Your support is my greatest motivation to keep sharing the rest of this journey. My father grabbed Carter's arm, trying to pull him back down, but he was shaking just as badly. Dad, my father pleaded, his voice cracking. You cannot possibly do this. Elijah doesn't understand money. He's just a nurse. He'll lose it all. We are your family. You have to leave the inheritance to the people who know how to protect it. He doesn't understand money? Grandpa repeated, his voice rising, the anger finally breaking through his calm facade. Because he isn't a ruthless shark like your son? Because he chose a profession that actually helps human beings instead of bankrupting them? You sicken me, Robert. Bernard reached into his leather briefcase one last time. He pulled out a sealed, cream-colored envelope. Arthur has also instructed me to read this personal letter aloud to all of you, right here, right now. We don't need to hear a letter, my mother sobbed, her expensive mascara running down her cheeks. Arthur, please. We can fix this. Read it, Bernard, Grandpa commanded. Bernard broke the wax seal and unfolded the heavy paper. He began to read Grandpa's exact words. To my son, my daughter-in-law, and my grandson. I am 82 years old. I have lived long enough to clearly see who people really are when they think no one else is watching. For 31 years, I have sat quietly and watched you systematically destroy Elijah's spirit. I watched you treat him like a backup plan, like hired domestic help, and like an embarrassment. Carter crossed his arms, staring at the floor. His face flushed a deep, angry red. May 2018, Bernard read. His nursing school graduation. You missed one of the most important days of his life to fly to Seattle. You sent him $100. You drained his childhood college fund to buy Carter designer suits and a luxury condo. And then you punished Elijah for having to work night shifts to survive. My father closed his eyes, unable to look at me. December 2020, his 28th birthday. He called you crying from a hospital floor after watching a patient suffocate from a virus. You, Diane, told him you were too busy celebrating Carter's promotion on a Zoom call to speak to him. You sent a traumatized frontline healthcare worker a $25 Starbucks gift card. My mother let out a loud, wretched sob and buried her face in her hands. And finally, this Christmas, you lied to his face. You left him a passive-aggressive note on the counter. You mocked his salary. You told him he was unsuccessful. And then you flew to Europe on a $72,000 vacation that you paid for, leaving me with a frozen dinner. Bernard lowered the paper and looked at them with absolute disgust. Elijah stayed. He checked my blood sugar. He cooked my meals. He sat with me on Christmas Day and didn't complain once. That is exactly why he gets everything. Wealth without character is poverty. You three are incredibly rich, but you are completely, utterly empty. If you ever want another dime from this family, you will have to beg Elijah for it. And it will be his absolute right to deny you. Signed, Arthur James Weston. The room was dead silent except for the sound of my mother's harsh weeping. Carter suddenly lunged forward, kicking the wooden chair out of his way. I'll contest it. I'm a lawyer. I know every judge in this county. I will drag this trust through probate court for the next decade until you are completely broke. Elijah. Bernard stood up. He buttoned his suit jacket calmly. Oregon law on testamentary capacity is incredibly strict, Mr. Weston. Your grandfather is lucid, uncoerced, and acting entirely of his own free will. I have 3 independent medical evaluations confirming his capacity. If you file a frivolous lawsuit, I will personally petition the court to have you pay all legal fees, which will quickly consume your $250,000 crumb. I strongly advise against testing me. Grandpa Arthur stood up slowly. He gripped his wooden cane, looked at the son he had raised, and pointed a shaking finger at the front door. Get out, Grandpa growled. Dad, this is my house. My father tried to argue. The deed is in my name. It has always been in my name, Grandpa fired back. I let you live here to maintain the illusion of your success. The illusion is over. Pack your bags and get out of my house. They left. They didn't apologize. They grabbed their expensive coats and their Louis Vuitton luggage and walked out the door in absolute, humiliating defeat. I stood by the window and watched the Porsche, the Rolls-Royce, and the Ferrari slowly back down the driveway and disappear through the gates. The silence that fell over the house after they left was deafening. It wasn't the lonely, heavy silence I was used to. It was the clear, ringing silence of a freshly cleaned wound. Bernard packed up his briefcase, shook my hand firmly, and told me his office would be in touch the next morning to transfer the banking authorizations. Then he left. Grandpa and I sat by the fire for a long time. Neither of us said a word. We didn't need to. The war was over, and the battlefield was empty. But my phone didn't stay quiet for long. At exactly 8:12 p.m., the notifications started rolling in like artillery fire. Text from Mom. Elijah, please pick up. This is a massive misunderstanding. We love you. We are family. Text from Mom. Please, sweetie. Your father's blood pressure is through the roof. We are staying at a hotel. Call me. Text from Dad. You are making a terrible mistake. You are tearing this family apart for money. By midnight, I had exactly 47 unread text messages and 12 missed calls. I didn't reply to a single one. I simply turned my phone on silent and went to sleep. The next morning, things escalated from emotional manipulation to legal threats. I opened my email while pouring my morning coffee and saw a message with the subject line, "Urgent. Legal notice regarding the estate of Arthur Weston." I opened it. It wasn't from Carter. It was from a man named Julian, a senior partner at Carter's corporate law firm. Julian was infamous in Portland for handling brutal, high-conflict custody battles and corporate hostile takeovers. He was a shark. The email read, "Elijah, I am acting informally on behalf of your brother. We have substantial reason to believe you exerted undue influence and elder abuse over Arthur Weston while he was isolated from his primary caretakers. If you do not agree to immediately dissolve the revised trust and split the assets equally, we will file a formal complaint with Adult Protective Services and seek a court injunction freezing all assets. Consider this your only warning. You do not want this kind of legal battle on your minimum wage salary." A week ago, an email like that would have sent me into a blind panic. I would have folded immediately just to keep the peace. But a week ago, I didn't have Bernard Price on speed dial. I forwarded the email directly to Bernard without adding a single word of commentary. 20 minutes later, my phone buzzed. It was Bernard. "Good morning, Elijah," Bernard said, his voice crisp. "I saw the email from Julian. Should I be worried?" I asked. "Not in the slightest," Bernard chuckled dryly. "Julian is a corporate bully trying to intimidate a hospice nurse. I just called his managing partner. I politely informed him that if his firm allows its partners to use firm letterhead to extort a beneficiary with baseless elder abuse claims, I will personally file a grievance with the Oregon State Bar for severe ethics violations. Julian formally withdrew his threat 3 minutes ago. Delete the email and enjoy your coffee." I smiled. The power dynamic hadn't just shifted. It had completely flipped upside down. By the third day, the immediate family had realized their threats were useless. That's when the extended family started coming out of the woodwork like termites. I was in the kitchen chopping vegetables for dinner when the doorbell rang. I wiped my hands on a towel and walked to the foyer. Standing on the porch was my older cousin, Wyatt. Wyatt was Aunt Clara's son. He had bounced from one failed business venture to another his entire life, always relying on his mother's divorce settlements to bail him out. He was holding a massive, expensive-looking gourmet fruit basket. He looked deeply sympathetic. "Elijah, man, it is so good to see you," Wyatt said, stepping inside without really waiting for an invitation. He set the heavy basket on the console table. "I heard what happened. Aunt Diane called my mom screaming her head off. I just want to say, I am so incredibly proud of you for standing up to them. They have treated you like absolute garbage for years." I crossed my arms. "Thanks, Wyatt. Seriously," he continued, following me into the living room. "Carter is a narcissistic sociopath. And your dad? Don't even get me started. They totally deserved to get completely cut off. Grandpa Arthur is a genius. I always knew you were the smart one in the family." "I appreciate you saying that," I said, waiting for the inevitable pivot. I knew my family too well. Nobody drives across town with a $50 fruit basket just to offer moral support. Sure enough, Wyatt sat down on the sofa, leaned forward, and rubbed his hands together. "Listen, Eli, since you're the trustee now, and you fully control the capital, I wanted to run a massive opportunity by you. You know, I've been heavily researching the crypto market, right? Specifically decentralized finance algorithms. I have a guaranteed startup model. I just need a small seed investment to get it off the ground. A loan, really, just $2 million. I can guarantee you a 40% return in 6 months." I stared at him. The sheer audacity was almost breathtaking. My own parents were currently living out of suitcases in a Marriott, and Wyatt was here trying to swindle $2 million out of me under the guise of family solidarity. "Wyatt, I said slowly. I have the pitch deck right here on my phone, he said eagerly, reaching into his pocket. Stop, I said, raising a hand. My voice was cold. I am not giving you $2 million to gamble on crypto. His friendly smile instantly vanished. His face hardened. Come on, Elijah. Don't be like Carter. Don't be greedy. You have $15 million just sitting there doing nothing. We are family. You're supposed to help family. Family? I echoed. Where was my family when I was working 80 hours a week to pay my rent? Where were you when I graduated? I don't remember seeing you at the ceremony. Grab your fruit basket, Wyatt, and get out. He stood up, his face red with sudden rage. You know what? You're just as bad as them. You get a little bit of power and you turn into a tyrant. Enjoy your empty house, you arrogant jerk. He stormed out, slamming the front door so hard the glass panes rattled. I locked the deadbolt behind him. I realized in that moment that money doesn't actually change people. It simply acts as a magnifying glass, exposing exactly who they have always been. I pulled out my phone and called Sarah. I needed to hear the voice of the only person who actually loved me when I had nothing. A week later, I drove downtown and sat in Bernard Price's sprawling, glass-walled office overlooking the Willamette River. I was wearing jeans and a simple sweater. I didn't need a designer suit to validate my presence there. Your parents have officially retained counsel, Bernard informed me, sliding a legal folder across his massive oak desk. But their lawyer knows they have absolutely zero legal standing to contest the trust. They are respectfully requesting a formal mediation. They want to know exactly what it will take for you to release funds to them. I didn't open the folder. I looked out the floor-to-ceiling window at the gray river. I had thought long and hard about this. I didn't want to be cruel. I didn't want to punish them just for the sake of causing pain. But I also refused to hand millions of dollars back to people who fundamentally viewed me as worthless. Tell their lawyer I will not release a single penny right now, I said firmly. But if they want me to even consider opening the door to financial assistance in the future, they must meet 3 non-negotiable conditions. Bernard pulled a silver pen from his pocket and poised it over a legal pad. I am listening. Condition 1, I said, ticking it off on my fingers. My parents must attend 12 consecutive months of intensive family therapy with a licensed clinical psychologist of my choosing. They must sign waivers allowing the therapist to confirm their attendance and participation. Bernard raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued. Agreed. Condition 2. Condition 2. My father and my mother must individually complete 50 hours of unpaid volunteer work at a designated inpatient hospice facility. They need to spend time sitting with the dying. They need to understand exactly what the unsuccessful people of the world do. A rare, genuine smile crossed Bernard's stoic face. That is incredibly poetic, Elijah. And condition 3. Condition 3, I finished. At the end of the 12 months, they must write me a handwritten letter. Not an email. Not a text. A physical letter detailing exactly what they did wrong over the last 30 years, taking full accountability, and explaining how they have changed. If I read it and I don't believe they are sincere, the vault stays permanently locked. And Carter? Bernard asked. Carter gets the exact same conditions, I said. Bernard drafted the terms and sent them via certified mail. 2 days later, I got a furious voicemail from my brother. He was screaming into the phone, his voice ragged. You want me to volunteer to wipe down hospital beds? You want me to write you an apology letter like a misbehaving middle schooler? You are out of your mind. Keep the money. I make my own money. I don't need to jump through your humiliating hoops. I deleted the voicemail. The ball was entirely in their court. What they did with it was their choice. We had exactly 5 weeks of peace. 5 weeks of sitting by the fire, drinking good coffee, and watching the winter snow slowly melt into the damp Oregon spring. Grandpa and I talked about everything. We talked about his childhood in a logging camp, his marriage to my grandmother, and my upcoming wedding to Sarah. Then, on the morning of February 3rd, 2025, the house was a little too quiet. I woke up at 6 a.m., my internal nurse clock waking me before the alarm. I went downstairs and started the coffee. Usually, I would hear the floorboards creaking in Grandpa's bedroom directly above the kitchen. But there was nothing. I poured a cup of coffee and walked upstairs. I knocked softly on his heavy wooden door. "Grandpa!" No answer. I pushed the door open. He was lying in his massive oak bed, the heavy quilt pulled up neatly to his chest. His eyes were closed. His face was entirely relaxed, free of the deep lines of pain that arthritis usually etched into his features. The room was cold. I set the coffee mug down on the nightstand. I placed my fingers gently against the side of his neck. There was no pulse. His skin was cool to the touch. He had passed away peacefully in his sleep. His tired, 82-year-old heart had simply stopped beating. I didn't panic. I didn't scream. As a hospice nurse, death is a familiar companion. But this wasn't a patient. This was the man who saved my life. I pulled up a chair next to the bed, took his cold, calloused hand in mine, and sat with him in the quiet dawn light for an hour. "Thank you," I whispered into the silent room, "for seeing me, for proving I wasn't crazy. You can rest now." He had prepaid and pre-planned his entire funeral years in advance. He didn't want a church service. He didn't want a massive viewing. He requested a simple, direct cremation, and he explicitly asked that his ashes be scattered in the soil of his beloved tomato garden in the backyard. We held the ash-scattering ceremony on a dreary Tuesday morning. My parents attended. Carter attended, standing as far away from me as physically possible. They all wore black designer coats, looking like they were attending a high society gala rather than a backyard memorial. Nobody spoke to me. My father looked broken, aging 10 years in the span of a month. My mother wouldn't meet my eyes. I opened the heavy urn and carefully scattered his ashes into the dark, rich soil of the raised garden beds he had tended to for nearly 40 years. I watched the gray dust mix with the earth. When it was over, my family turned and walked back to their cars without a word. I stayed in the garden until the sun went down. Time moved forward as it always does. 6 months passed. It was late August. I was sitting on the back patio of the Lake Oswego house, my house now. I opened a thick manila envelope that had arrived in the morning mail. It was the 6-month progress report from Dr. Ellen Moss, the clinical psychologist I had mandated for my parents. I read the clinical notes carefully. Diane Weston has attended 24 consecutive sessions. She initially presented with extreme defensiveness and narcissistic deflection. However, during session 14, a breakthrough occurred regarding her own childhood trauma and how she projected her insecurities onto her youngest son. She exhibited genuine, profound remorse and wept extensively. Robert Weston has completed his 50 hours of volunteer service at the Providence Hospice Center. The facility director noted that Robert initially struggled with the emotional weight of the environment. However, during his final week, Robert sat vigil for 12 continuous hours with a dying veteran who had no family. Robert was visibly emotionally impacted and requested to continue volunteering past his mandated hours. I set the papers down on the patio table. A strange, heavy knot in my chest slowly began to loosen. They were actually doing it. Stripped of their financial leverage, forced to confront the ugly reality of their own actions, they were slowly starting to do the agonizing work of becoming better human beings. Included in the envelope was a folded piece of paper. I opened it. It was a handwritten letter from my mother. It didn't ask for money. It didn't make excuses. It was 4 pages of desperate, agonizing apologies for the pain she had caused me. I wasn't ready to forgive them yet. 30 years of emotional abuse isn't erased by 6 months of therapy. But for the very first time in my life, I was willing to leave the door unlocked. As for Carter, he never attended a single therapy session. He never stepped foot inside a hospice facility. His massive ego simply wouldn't allow him to submit to my rules. He took his $250,000 inheritance, combined it with a risky loan, and bought a massive luxury yacht to impress his corporate clients. Rumor had it he was currently drowning in debt, desperately trying to keep up appearances. I didn't care. I hadn't spoken to him since the day he was kicked out of the house. It has been nearly 2 years since that fateful Christmas. I didn't quit my job. I still work 20 hours a week as a hospice nurse. I still hold the hands of dying strangers. I still comfort grieving families. But now I do it entirely because I want to, not because I am desperate for a paycheck to make rent. Last year, I formally established the Arthur James Weston Memorial Grant. I donated $2 million to the Oregon Hospice Foundation to fully fund a brand new palliative care wing. It provides free, dignified end-of-life care for patients who don't have health insurance. I sold the massive, echoing Lake Oswego estate. It held too many ghosts. Sarah and I bought a beautiful, modest 4-bedroom house on the edge of a massive pine forest just outside the city. We have a huge backyard where I built raised garden beds. I grow tomatoes just like Grandpa used to. Last June, I took Sarah to Multnomah Falls. I waited until the tourists cleared out, got down on one knee on the wet stone bridge, and asked her to marry me. She cried and she said yes. The money didn't change who I fundamentally am, but it completely freed me. It freed me from the desperate, exhausting cycle of begging for my parents' approval. It freed me from believing I was a failure because my bank account wasn't overflowing. My name is Elijah Weston. I am 28 years old. I am a registered hospice nurse. I am a fiancé, and I am, finally, incredibly successful. Not because I have $15 million in the bank. I am successful because I finally realized my worth, and I refused to let anyone discount it ever again. Thank you for sticking around and listening to my story. It's not easy reliving those moments, but sharing it feels like a weight has been lifted. I hope this resonated with you in some way. Family dynamics can be incredibly complicated, and sometimes the hardest thing in the world is setting a boundary with the people who are supposed to love you the most. Have you ever found yourself in a similar situation, where you had to walk away from toxic family members or stand up for your own worth? Tell me about it in the comments. I read every single one. Before you go, I want to invite you to join something special. If you've made it all the way to the very end of this video, you are officially part of the 1% Club. Do me a huge favor and comment the letter W down below. W stands for winner. It's our secret code, a sign to let me know that you are part of the amazing group of people who stayed with me until the very last word. If my story touched you, please hit that like button, and don't forget to follow the channel so we can continue to share more incredible stories together. Take care of yourselves, know your worth, and I'll see you in the next one.